Now, this gets very, very complicated because, as we know, there's several things you should bear in mind. One of the things you should bear in mind is their obvious anti-Semitism. And part of this I cannot develop here, but the short version is, let some of you know, I am addressing you, and I'm a black Jewish man. The fact of the matter is, Jews are not historically white people, but there's a complicated issue around white supremacy that has offered a form of lure to certain Jewish populations, particularly those among neoconservatives who imagined to some extent that they actually belong in certain white supremacist networks. And the logic they have developed over the years is part of what has informed these kinds of activities. And part of it, of course, has led to a catch-22, and I'm going to use the word white Jews. It has created a catch-22 for white Jews, because for white Jews, for the white supremacists, they're not white enough because they think black people are too stupid to be politically able to transform our condition. So it must be a kind of white mediator. So for those individuals, it must be white Jews. That's how their anti-Semitism has manifested itself. It's done so not only in the United States. I see this discourse in South Africa. I see this discourse in Europe. I see it in different parts of the world. Among black populations, there is a view that white Jews, by virtue of not being white enough, function as a form of liberal mediator. And again, what happens there is the idea of this displaced middle that is going to betray on both ends. So there's a certain logic that's done that's linking white Jews, and especially the linking to the category of capital, that fosters this kind of resentment. To put simply, it is correct to look at this phenomenon as linked in not only to the question of global fascism and neo-Nazi behavior and racism, but also its intimate connection to anti-Semitism. Now, before I go further, I should say I'm one of these critics of the notion of anti-Semitism because I see anti-Semitism as properly a form of racism. It's a complicated issue because there are people who like to look at Jews exclusively in religious terms. But the issue is a lot more complicated than many people would imagine. And for an anti-Jew, a Jew-hating Nazi, a Jewish individual is not a religion, is a race. So I bring that up because it's very crucial to understand the next symmetry I'm very critical of. It's no accident that they chose a college town, a college area. And these individuals for the past 40 years have been targeting universities. One of the reasons is that if they could undermine the important role of the professoriate of dealing with evidence, fact, truth, and reality, then what emerges is the delusions of investments in opinion. It creates a false symmetry between the student and the professor at the point of meeting, and it also creates the conditions to create an extension of this in indoctrinating services all the way through to commercial entities such as Fox News and the right-wing commercial networks of information, or rather misinformation, across the country and the globe. Now, when people hear this, they at first may be a little hesitant until one begins to realize that one of the techniques, which is the exact technique the president used, President Trump, is this stupid notion of balance. You see, balance can be an issue about opinion, but there is no balance in facts. Facts either are or they are not. Truth either is or it is not. Reality smacks you in the face. Truth is that there's a woman last Friday who was alive and she is now under the ground. She is buried. That's not an opinion. That's a fact. And it's a fact that that woman's murder was a consequence of certain ideological positions that were actual functions of actual indoctrination. In universities, which are the targets also of these groups, and why we have a group such as the Global Center for Advanced Studies, is because we understand that there's a form of not only commodification, but colonization in an effort to stratify universities whose fundamental responsibility is truth and the furthering of knowledge. So what we have here then is a situation in which we have individuals who have functioned in effect like classic sleeper cells in terrorist groups. Now, Many of the listeners may not have studied these groups enough, but I've been studying them for more than 30 years. And I could tell you, all of the mechanisms we talk about with Al Qaeda are with these groups, with the big difference that they're able to function, in some cases, in the open in parts of the United States, such as Idaho, or parts of in places such as Wyoming, Utah, but they're also in sleeper cells across the country. They infiltrate universities, they're in parts of government, they're in the police force. But the fact of the matter is, what enables them to function the way they do, and for us not to call them out the way we do, is this kind of false symmetry of it being a both sides discourse. And as some people have been correctly saying, there is no correct side to neo-Nazism, fascism, and racism. So one of the things I'd like to say very quickly around the symmetry issue is we're going to have to admit that there is not a symmetrical logic between the right and the left. The fact of the matter is the right has a completely different project from the left. What right-wingism is about, what the turn to the right is about, it starts off with an innocent-sounding premise, which is conservatism. And conservatism basically has a very basic point. It's originally what you want to conserve, so it links to tradition. But it's also something you have to bear in mind that has been analyzed very well by the Spanish philosopher Ortega y Gasset. And he basically says once you make a turn to the right, once you make the turn to conservatism, it's often connected to a conception of law that ultimately asks you a very simple, straightforward question. And Ortega y Gasset said it beautifully. He says, what are you willing to give up for your individual sense of security? Now, I could say why I'm proud of my daughter and why I've over the years, and many people, including people who are listening here, some of my colleagues, why I'm actually proud of them. Because they realize that freedom, liberty, and dignity they're not willing to give up, which is why they go out on the streets, and it's why they speak their mind and why they defend these issues publicly. And so one of the things we have to bear in mind is if you say you will give those things up, you're on your road to fascism. If you'll give up liberty, freedom, if you're going to say it's all about your individual security, the slide to fascism, which is the direction neoconservatism had began in many institutions. For instance, among the organizers of Charlottesville was an individual who had degrees from the University of Chicago, from Duke, from a lot of the elite corridors of the country. The fact of the matter is something that I've observed over the years is that when we undermine the professional responsibility and the ethical and political responsibility of the professoriate to speak truth, we open our doors to put on a leveled playing field a phony conversation with sociopaths. The fact of the matter is that they're individuals, and there is a concerted effort, an organized effort from think tanks and other such entities to undermine the very healthy functioning of the professoriate. And it's for a very straightforward reason. Excellent education cultivates dissent. And the fact of the matter is, with citizenship and conceptions of democracy that work properly require people's ability to dissent, but dissent on the basis of evidence. In other words, to train, to learn, and to cultivate a thinking mind is a mind that is able to be connected to and attuned to reality, evidentiality, fact, and truth. So in effect, what we're dealing with is an effort which began in a very crazy reactionary response to the idea of civil order for more than 40 years to organize what we see today. So this brings up the very crucial element of an organization such as this one, because you notice the crucial word global in the Global Center for Advanced Studies. What we understand is that this problem is not only Charlotte's problem, it's not only the United States problem, it's a global problem. And it's a global problem because we live in a world right now in which there's been an ascent of plutocrats, kleptocrats, and ongoing nihilism around governing and politics. It is bizarre that we can have such clear cases of people right now running governing institutions who are clearly beholden to corporate entities such as Exxon and others to whom they will return, post their period of service in office. It is really clear that we're witnessing a form of global coup d'etat of market and other forms of infrastructural setting into place a conception of globalism committed to the disenfranchisement, the disempowerment of large portions of our planet. But the fact of the matter is we should also bear in mind that people on our planet are also paying attention to the global changes. We live in a smaller world, a world of 7 and growing billion people. We live in a world of informatic and other forms of global technologies moving forth. The fact that we can speak to each other across the globe right now is a testament to this. We're living in a world right now in which the very situation of how we're to reorganize ourselves require a better understanding of what it is to be global. And global is different from international. International is where you can have separate nationalistic enterprises looking at each other. Global is where we recognize that connectedness. So as we look at this, what's important is the very fact that globally people can see the tragedy of what the Charlottesville situation represents. And so I'm going to close with just pointing out one important delusion to understand about these supremacist groups. These supremacist groups imagine that that the world is ultimately both, not only metaphorically, but literally black and white. And within that framework, they think if they could cultivate a sufficient amount of disruption, it would force whites to choose the sides to which they belong. In other words, it is a message ultimately of a form of forced loyalties. This means then that although there are instances of suasion, there are instances of individualized, cultivated change of views, what they're counting on is a structural political imposition onto other groups of people. This means that if one is going to have resistance to these issues, if one is going to fight these issues, and if we're going to change them, our responses have to be political. We could have our moral motivations. We could say, that ain't right. It's not what we're down with. It's not what we're going to do. But the fact of the matter is, we need to build coalitions, institutions that will actually reorganize power into the directions in which those individuals can become irrelevant. I often put it this way. The issue for me is not that there are immoral people in the world. The issue for me is that there are immoral people who have power. If we can get them off of us, if we can set the conditions in which their behavior is contained and their behavior is ultimately inconsequential, we can actually set the conditions for new relationships through which to build a better condition for our species, for our understanding of who we are. And on that regard, one of the things we need to address is also a form of species arrogance. It means the moment we understand the interconnectedness, we understand our responsibility for this planet. It means we understand our responsibilities for other life forms. And it also means we understand that no matter what we say, if we keep sticking holes into this ship at sea that we call the planet Earth, we're all going to sink together. Thank you.